The Fantastic Four are losing their powers. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Fantastic Four tie-in for One World Under Doom. Now, in the last video, we talked about how Valeria Richards and Franklin Richards were whisked off to alternate realities, but the overarching theme of what's happening with the Fantastic Four at the moment is they're trying to figure out a way to restore Ben Grimm's powers after Dr. Doom basically turned him back into a human. Now, here's the cool thing about this. Initially, this starts with H.E.R.B.I.E. Most of you guys are aware of H.E.R.B.I.E. as the robot from the Fantastic Four, if for no other reason than the movie trailer. But Valeria is the one that kind of fills us in. And she says, let's go over what we know first. Uncle Ben's loss of his powers means you're all losing your powers too. Now, those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Fantastic Four, in Marvel 2-in-1, which is technically called Volume 1, but it's actually more like Volume 2 from 2018 by Chip Zdarsky, actually established this. Now, I'm sure the concept existed long before that particular story, but I can't really find a source, so I'm not going to swear to it. But one of the things that that story established is that if any member of the Fantastic Four loses their powers, or if the Fantastic Four are separated from each other for too long, their powers will actually go away, and they'll just revert back to normal human beings. So that's one of the reasons why the team always stays together. A pretty cool little bit of history when it comes to their characters. But she says, secondly, cosmic rays can get those powers back, because that's how they originally gained their powers. And she says, thirdly, we've tried to harvest these rays from other universes, and we failed. Hence the whole basis behind the previous story that we did earlier. I'll have a link to the playlist if you guys want to check it out. And she says, it came to me in a flash when we were in orbit, and I realized there's somewhere else in our universe that's chock full of precisely the same kind of cosmic rays that we need. We go back in time to 436 quadrillion seconds ago, to the start of everything, and we expose Ben to the abundant cosmic rays that existed there. That's how we fix this. That's how we solve everything. 4 words, everyone: harvest the Big Bang. Now, while all this is being explained by Valeria, H.E.R.B.I.E.'s kind of overhearing it all. And one of the cool things about H.E.R.B.I.E. is that you don't really get a lot of interaction with him in Marvel Comics. You did in the old school days, right? Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, John Byrne, so on and so forth. But one of the cool things is he kind of talks about how he's not really alive, so he can't really die, but he can assist, and that it's cool to be able to assist because the Fantastic Four are in trouble and the world basically needs them, so he can do what he can, where he can to help them out whenever he can. That's going to become important here in a minute, because what ends up happening is Valeria continues on, and she says, we'll arrive after the Planck epoch, so at least physics as we know it still applies, but before 10 minus to the 12 seconds when the quark epoch begins. So basically, a very small period in time. Now, she's throwing out a bunch of sciencey terms that probably do exist here in the real world, but I don't understand enough about it. So basically, all she's really saying here is, we're going to science the hell out of this, and we're going to go back to the Big Bang, and we're going to give Ben his powers back. But the funny thing is, you do get some kind of back and forth between her and Reed, which is really a testament to how intelligent Valeria is. Some would argue she's actually smarter than Reed, depending on the circumstance. But he says all that existed at that point in time was an inferno at 10 to the 15 degrees Kelvin, with energies that would tear apart any spacecraft on contact. There's even antimatter that hasn't even been annihilated yet. So I'm sorry, Val, but anything there would be absolutely eradicated within a second of its arrival. And that's where Valeria is like, you're 100% right, Dad, right? You absolutely nailed it. Anything there for longer than a second would basically be destroyed. So that's why we're going to be there for nanoseconds. Now, this train of thought from Valeria, this thought process she has, is why the Future Foundation exists in the first place in Marvel Comics. Those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, or maybe you've just heard about it in passing, the Future Foundation was a think tank composed of children that Reed Richards brought together. The idea being that adults kind of have a tendency to think inside the box. There's not enough imagination, whereas when you have children who are ultra smart, they combine imagination with their intelligence, and the sky's the limit. And so that's why Valeria is such a handy person to have around, because she says, we time travel back to the Big Bang just long enough to expose Ben to cosmic rays, and then we come back here. It's actually safer for history than going to your origin when there's comparatively fewer cosmic rays carrying far too much historical weight. Because that's true. Because if they change any one thing, the flight path of an asteroid, that asteroid could circle back around and Earth could be destroyed by the time they get back here. There's any number of things that could happen when you start screwing with time. It's one of Reed's biggest rules, right? Time is a living organism. We learned that in Age of Ultron. And so at that point, it kind of comes down to everybody just sort of being like, I mean, yeah, we could actually do this. Now, Reed is, I wouldn't say the last holdout, but he's still a guy that's looking at it more from like a science perspective as opposed to Susan and Johnny, who were kind of like, I mean, this could probably work. He says, Val, I appreciate the creativity, but no, right? It cannot be done. There isn't a material in the universe that can withstand any of that. But that's where Susan chimes in. And she's like, I still have enough strength left for a force field. I could direct some of that energy away from us. The response of Johnny, I could absorb all that heat, right? At least as much as I possibly can. I still have a little bit of power left. And so Ben's just like, I mean, I couldn't ask you guys to do that for me. And everybody else is just like, Ben, hush, you're family, right? We help family out. And so it's one of these cool things because Susan's just kind of like, okay, so here's the thing. We all know that if we don't do this, all of us are going to lose our powers and doom will ruin our world. So I guess it's just like you always say, Reed, we have to try. And so Reed's just like, all right, man, you guys heard the boss, right? The wife says we got to do it, means we got to do it. So it's one of these cool things because at that point, they're all kind of conversing on how this whole thing's going to get done, right? Susan says, since nanoseconds are too small for any human to work in, we'll need a computerized pilot to fly us back. And that's when they're like, okay, H.E.R.B.I.E can be the one to do it. And that's when they're kind of told, right? Unfortunately, even H.E.R.B.I.E cannot respond in the time frames required, at least not as currently constructed. So they're like, we kind of have to rebuild him from the ground up, right? We're going to have to literally change the entirety of his system, right? All the wiring and everything, because what they now need is H.E.R.B.I.E to be able to process information at an exceedingly rapid rate, far faster than he's normally able to do. So quite literally, it's an upgrade. And this is when you switch over to H.E.R.B.I.E's perspective. And it's one of the coolest things because he says, Reed and Valeria begin my upgrades. I am awake for all of it. They talk to me, keep me company, and to evaluate the results of their changes. I now think faster. I feel somehow more than what I was. It is different, more complex, but pleasant. My chassis is crammed with computational machinery at the highest possible density. I've grown. I've changed. I know I'm now ready to help save everyone. In parallel, the others are building shielding for their new time craft. It's the material with the highest known melting point, a hafnium carbonitride mixed anion compound, which may or may not exist in here in the real world. I have no idea. But he says, it will not survive the maelstrom of the early universe. Nothing will, nothing can, but it may buy even the tiniest sliver of time, and thus it is worth it. And he says, then we are ready. And so everybody kind of prepares for this mission. And one of the things that I kind of hope you guys notice here when it comes to this bit of a story is that it's basically a time of celebration. The Fantastic Four do understand the dangers that are here, and there are certainly times in Marvel Comics when the Fantastic Four get a little carried away with what they're capable of. They don't necessarily take all the best precautions possible. And that's actually how things are going to play out here. They kind of overestimate what it is that they're able to do and the significance of what they're jumping into. But there's also a reason for that we'll talk about as we kind of get further into the video. And so what they all end up doing is basically cramming into what is essentially a time travel device. And H.E.R.B.I.E just says, hello, right? I'm interfaced directly with the Timecraft's computer controls. Our itinerary has been programmed in and we are ready to begin. Please prepare yourself for transit. Of course, everybody kind of sits down and everybody takes their places and it's like, okay, so just out of curiosity, we're going to be in this place where we're going to be like super heated and everybody's kind of like, yeah. And it's like, so we're not going to land here, right? Back in the lab, which is actually a valid concern. I don't know, maybe they'll set the atmosphere on fire. I have no clue. Or they'll just be so astronomically hot that everyone who's here would immediately be incinerated by the heat. So it's like, no, right? We're going to basically respawn out in Earth's orbit. And then we'll descend back down to Earth once we've basically cooled down. So again, small little precautions here and there. But that's why Reed also chimes in to remind everybody, right? Our powers weaken with separation, which means my presence may allow allow for Sue and Johnny to sustain their contributions for longer. Again, it's not a permanent thing. Their powers are waning. And so as the ship prepares to take off, Susan says, I'm manifesting the strongest force field I can still muster, and I'll focus on nothing else until we're back. Johnny, right? And Johnny's like, I'm on it. And he says, Herbie, engage the pre-programmed flight in 10 seconds, which gives Johnny the ability to start amping up and basically absorbing heat, so that by the time they arrive, basically at the Big Bang, his powers will be quote unquote fully charged, for lack of a better word. And so Herbie kind of continues on, and he says, Susan Storm's force field increases the traverse rupture strength, fracture toughness, and Vickers hardness of the vessel, and Johnny Storm begins absorbing all the heat he still can. I power up the engines. Whether we succeed or fail, we begin what is certain to be the shortest voyage ever undertaken by the Fantastic Four. We go all the way back to the beginning of everything. And literally, they wind all the way back to that moment. And Herbie says, what happens next happens in nanoseconds, fractions of a second. He says, Ben is exposed to cosmic rays, as intended. I order the ship to re-engage its time engine and return us to the present. And that engine fails. Already, our craft is being annihilated. There are no longer sufficient resources to send the ship back. Abundant corrections to power are failing, and they absolutely cannot be repaired or replaced in the fractions of a second left before we're all destroyed. Plasma blasts into the disintegrating vessel at hyper speed. It's incredibly fast, but so too are my new senses, my new mind. I have time. I use precious picoseconds, too many considering the problem. An idea. Instead of sending the entire time craft back to the present, what if it remained here and the time engine was modified to send just its occupants back instead? All 5 of us would return to the present in the vacuum of Earth orbit, which can both suffocate and freeze biological life in seconds. But compared to here, seconds are a relative eternity. And he says, it could work. I adjust the time engine to target us instead of the ship and double check my modifications. It spins up, and yet even as a temporal warp forms around each of us, I can tell this will not work either. The ship has failed still more during the time of my modifications. There is no longer enough power remaining to send all 5 of us back. We're too much matter demanding too much energy. Thankfully, I arrive at my next decision instantaneously. I remove myself from the transport list, and Reed, Sue, Ben, and Johnny are sent back to their own era far from here. 4 nanoseconds remain before the maelstrom reaches me. It is pure destruction, completely unavoidable, utterly certain, but it is still 4 nanoseconds away. And what he says here is incredibly touching. He says, the thought comes before I even realize I'm thinking it. I know for a fact I was not programmed to love, and yet I know with just as much certainty that I do. I feel like I always did, only now I have the means to understand it. Here at the end, I understand that if I can love, then I am alive. And if I am alive, then I can die. But death will be worth it. I was H.E.R.B.I.E, a humanoid experimental robot, B-type, integrated electronics. I lived in the Baxter Building, I assisted the Fantastic Four, and I saved the people I love. And in that moment, Herbie's completely eradicated. Now keep in mind, all that took place in fractions of a second. Fractions of a second, but it is so profound and it's so incredible because the Fantastic Four pop up right out in orbit, literally outside the Earth. Susan Storm, of course, creates force fields. They end up crashing back down to the Baxter Building, and everybody's celebrating the fact that they are back. There isn't really much in the way of this kind of sadness about the loss of H.E.R.B.I.E. It's not to say they don't care. It's simply because of the fact that there comes a point when Reed has a conversation with Valeria. Now, this conversation is stupendously important because this will become a major focal point of the Fantastic Four as a team within Marvel Comics. You'll see this all over the place. Various discussions and Respect the Fantastic Four posts and all kinds of stuff. One of the things Reed reveals here is that he had actually backed up H.E.R.B.I.E, right, from the pre-time travel backup that he had. So H.E.R.B.I.E's fine, right? But the fact is that Valerie says, every cosmological model that we've got says the Big Bang should have created matter and antimatter in perfect symmetry. One piece of antimatter for one piece of matter. But that means they should have destroyed each other in perfect symmetry too, leaving nothing behind. But they didn't, which means in those earliest moments of our universe, something must have favored baryons over antibaryons ever so slightly. Basically matter over antimatter. And that tiniest imbalance was all that was needed for our universe to be filled with quarks and atoms and molecules and matter and everything. And Reid says, indeed, right, we've never been able to figure out how that imbalance could happen or why. And it's been both a central and an unsolved problem in modern physics since its discovery. And that's where Valeria says, and earlier today, 13.7 billion years ago, H.E.R.B.I.E sacrificed himself and our time ship in those very moments. And she says, I can't stop thinking about how much they were both made of matter, which, as they were destroyed, would have necessarily annihilated an equivalent amount of antimatter, just enough to be a thumb on the scale in the early universe, like how a minuscule change to the angle you leave at can have a colossal effect on where you end up. And so she asks, is it possible, Dad, could what we did today be somehow responsible for everything in a closed time loop? Could H.E.R.B.I.E be the reason why the whole universe exists? Now, this is one of these things that you're going to see referenced time and time again. You can see the post right now, right? You know, quote unquote, the Fantastic Four traveled back in time to the beginning of the Big Bang and are the reason why the universe exists. The introduction of H.E.R.B.I.E could have been just enough matter to basically make sure that matter and antimatter didn't cancel each other out and kind of fizzle out, right? Like a candle blowing out. That instead, H.E.R.B.I.E being there allowed for the creation of all things that exist. And so Reid doesn't actually really give it a whole lot of thought, right? He just says, you know, I rebuilt H.E.R.B.I.E today, restoring him from his pre-upgrade backup, and informed him of what we believe happened during our trip. He, of course, had and could have no knowledge of what was done back then either, but he did say something curious. And he says, he told me that if he were ever moved to sacrifice himself, he believes it would be because of love. Isn't that strange? And if love is the reason why there's something in our universe instead of nothing, why there's endless life instead of endless void, I'm not a robot, Val, but to me, that computes. So it's a beautiful story. It's a small little self-contained story, but it's gorgeous. It's one of these stories that Ryan North wrote that perfectly feeds into the role of the Fantastic Four as explorers, as people who chart the stars, treat the universe like a map of pins and pin everything, right? It's one of the coolest things about them. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. I love this story. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.